Senator Carroll very graciously has agreed to join us tonight, and I thank you very much for doing this. A lot of people have a lot of questions about the session. And this guy over here, Mike Whitman, is back. Yeah, he can't get that down. And we're really happy to have him, and he's got lots of questions, and they'll do their thing, and then we'll open it up to questions from you all. And again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
All right, so this is our first event. It'll go down, historians will record this day. Not the good historians.
I'm a historian.
Here we go.
Tom will write it down.
We'll record this day, and we're pretty excited. It's very gracious of Morgan to be the first. She didn't know she was the first, but to be one of the first to do that. So that was very gracious of her. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to be very informal, and I'll start asking some questions. And then you guys I'll look to you guys to ask some questions. And it'll just be, hopefully, they'll get some nasty ones. And we'll get into maybe some fisticuffs, but not like the ledge. Won't be anything like the ledge, so just be friendly. So let me start out. I asked Bartle a couple of questions. So the first question she gave me, she considered Cadman's absence of malice remark a real apology or not? So let's go ahead and explain what happened. This was like, how many days? 2 days after everyone said we're going to be friends and hugging, and we're going to put last year behind us, and this year is the new year. So tell us what happened.
I would figure that she'd lead with something that I would probably rather never had happened at all. So for those of you who followed what happened, there was sort of a staged diatribe with a lot of accusations that happened last week from the minority leader. What happened is a member flipped the order of 2 of their bills. So out of 5 bills you get, they each come with different deadlines. And so the member had flipped the order of what was being introduced, was a new member. Everything was done in by the deadlines.
A recaller, by the way.
Right, so what Senator Cadman thought that Senator Rivera's repeal of the background checks was his first bill, and that he had a license plate bill that was the second bill. And the nonpartisan staff at the desk had processed the license plate bill as his first bill and the background checks as the second bill. So there's different deadlines that flow. I'm only legally allowed to see and go off of what the nonpartisan staff provide because the rest is confidential. So because Senator Cadman had assumed the reverse order from that, it led to basically a 20-minute diatribe at the well saying it was a historic abuse of process. It was messing just because it was Senator Rivera and just because of background check. And then compounded with that, on all the gun bills last year, we ran out of time where some people who showed up to testify didn't get to testify on bills. So we waived the deadlines on the gun bills so that we could give each one this year, even in its repeal attempts, a full day and a full hearing. So he looked at the extension that was given on that, saw the date of April 16th, and assumed that the bill wouldn't be introduced until then, and assumed it had significance because of the Columbine, and on and on and on. Anyway, it's the totally usual form for what is filled out. It's actually to give the senator a whole day all to himself for his bill. And it is the deadlines, everything was introduced according to deadlines. And so when he realized, I showed him, the deadlines from the nonpartisan staff privately in his office, and had that dawning moment of, oh. He's like, we gotta walk this back. How do we walk this back? And so, trying to find a way to help Senator Cadman save a little bit of face after he really uncorked. I don't know if you guys saw this, but it was pretty ugly. And I said, well, why don't you just say that there's a mistake in the process and we're getting it out and we figured it out. And it didn't even amount to that. What we got at the well was that he convinced himself there was an absence of malice. Meanwhile, our nonpartisan staff are like in tears, and I mean, they're really upset by this because the next day, you know, he could come up and he's like, name names. I want to know, name names. Tell me your name right now. Name names. And so, like, they're literally tearing up, trying to figure out how between downstairs and upstairs, sort of the order of two bills got blocked. So that is honestly what had happened there was the absence of malice and apology, not in my book. But I was always ready to move forward then, today, now, and things that I was hoping would be more important for our session.
So he used the R word though, right?
Yeah.
So this was like on the first real day of the session?
So let's see, so session started Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I think this was maybe
Monday. Okay.
Monday.
So he used the R word, which of course is now the dirtiest word in Colorado politics. Talking about recall. So when we're getting to the very first bills, we already had the recall brought up. So tell me, the whole idea was that recalls wouldn't hang like a cloud over this session. It seems like recalls are already hanging like a cloud over this session.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a before and after moment for those of us who've gone through recalls where we really do now realize anyone can be recalled sort of at any time for any reason. So I don't think we were under any illusion. It's like a new toy that's been uncovered. And so when you can't win an election fair and square, and when the majority of people actually don't agree with your policies, but you lose, this is sort of, you guys remember when they first started like, oh, well, we're going to impeach Clinton, and then, so this is when someone gets in office and it's not your party and you can't win an election, I think you look for other process where you can do this. And so I don't think that there's any thought that recalls frankly ever go away again. I'm just being honest with you. It's not just the Senate, it's not the session. For us, we still have to govern. We've got a job to do. We can't live in, fear of our shadow looking over our shoulder. But that was one thing privately. He said, okay, well, so I sort of apologize for two things. One was when I told the press that I hope that they recalled you. I am kind of sorry about that. And this was over his mistake on the bill deadline. And the other was, well, I guess they didn't print it, so I'm sorry about that too, but you didn't see it. And he said, and I was like, oh, you mean the part where you said you were sorry about seconding my nomination for president? He said, oh, you did see it. Okay, well, I'm sorry about that one too. So I think that...
So was there absence of malice in either of those, do you think?
Good question. I mean, I think it's like a pressure cooker for what's going on, and it means that the dedication it takes to actually stay focused on public policy and actually govern is going to be as hard or harder than it's ever been. And I don't think recalls are ever going to be far away from the backdrop in the Colorado political climate, as far as I can see for the foreseeable future.
Do you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, somebody said that you could change the recall policies and make it about malfeasance and that kind of thing, and not just as an option as you lost the last election. What's the chance of that changing ever? Is it too late for it?
So, some of you may know that the recall laws are a hybrid of statutory and constitutional measures. So the no-fault basis of recall is rooted in the Constitution. In order to have a cause-based recall, it would require a change of Constitution. So for the legislature, that would mean 2/3 votes, which we're not hugely likely to get, or it would take a vote of the people in order to pass that constitutionally. There are some things statutorily, but the things that would make the biggest changes are all in the Constitution. And for those of you who followed this previously, they don't even align well. So there's inconsistencies and conflicts between recall provisions in our Constitution and in our statutes, which led to a bunch of litigation. Frankly, those inconsistencies still aren't figured out. So the really meaningful changes, like having malfeasance or having done something wrong, would require a constitutional change.
So I was listening to part of Chris Christie's speech today, and it sounded a lot like Hickenlooper's, and about we're not like Washington. We don't. No, this is not what New Jersey is like, even though I'm about to be possibly impeached. But in the past in Colorado, there's been some nastiness, and you as a strong woman have seen some nastiness up close, I know, in the legislature, but generally speaking, it's not nasty. And do you think the Washington nastiness has infected the states? Is it part of what's going on here?
Yeah, I think Colorado, so anyone who's followed politics knows that, everyone has their share of bumps, but I do think it's a fair characterization that Colorado's done business pretty differently than DC. Some of that's our culture, some of it's our laws. The fact that every bill has to get a public hearing, you can't pocket veto, that we've got single subject, that we don't get to do writers' earmarks, and the fact that we can actually pass a law at all, and do is different. But I think that the rhetoric, I think part of what's changed, and I think there is a role for the media in this as well, that I think we have a hardcore machine that is full-time in spin mode, where we've replaced a lot of news with basically hyper-partisan punditry and frankly stuff that I think borders on nearly hate speech every day, all the time, that isn't really designed to help people understand issues. And so to the extent that that's hardening, it's making it a lot harder to find people that you can work with. It's making primary dynamics. I'll at least say that, when I'm working with Republican colleagues, those that work with us face a very real risk of reprisal on, for not being pure enough. The second they work with us or vote with us on any bill, they are now facing a very real risk of primary on that, which means that the only safe thing for the Republicans at this point is just to keep their name away from anything that we propose. We're seeing that federally. We're starting to see that happen more at the state level. And while we had, the overwhelming majority of our bills were done with bipartisan support last year, in the 9 years I've been there, we're seeing partisan votes on things that would have been bipartisan in the past. And so I'm concerned, one of the things that concerns me about not only recall is just that we wind up in a 24-hour campaign cycle where the goal is more to score political points or to embarrass somebody or to do character assassination than to actually sit down like adults in the room and identify some problems and take a serious look at what we can do to solve those problems. And so I do think that's how far down the road DC is, and I think that if we're not careful, some of the best things of Colorado's culture are threatening to look more like DC.
So what do you do to change that culture? Can it be changed on local? If this is a culture that's everywhere, and it is pretty much everywhere now. You've seen. This was a recent piece in the Times about this single how states that have the governor and control both houses of the legislature, and how there is this sort of quick ramming going on to get your side in there in the period that you have it, and it's causing bad feeling everywhere. So if the bad feeling's everywhere, how do you do anything about what's going on here?
Well, I'm not sure anything I can think of tonight is the final thought, but I do think, I think we need to figure out, it's a worthwhile question where people get their news. I would say honestly that one of the changes we're seeing is not just a more partisan elected body, but I think the electorate themselves We've seen a hardening of where these lines go that are moving towards a fringe among people who actually vote, and a growing majority of other people who just check out. And I think one of the structural risks we face is that people don't all check out equally. So people who are most idealistic about how they think civics should work or how they think government should work, even if it's one side who's behaving particularly poorly, the minute you start to see examples of government not working, it's the people who have the highest standards for how they think it should work that are the first to get heartbroken, the first to get disappointed, the first to check out and say, why do I even bother? I'm not even going to participate. And so, unfortunately, in some roundabout way, the worst behavior winds up rewarding the people for their worst behavior, because the people who support them in that behavior sort of vote no matter what. I think we have to get better at finding new ways to actually get information out there. Maybe there's two sides to every story, but there isn't, there is such a thing as fact checking. Not everything everyone says is true, and not everything that's put out in a quote is true. And, when it comes to replacing news with talk radio, which maybe doesn't have the same editorial and fact-checking process, I think that's a problem. And I think maybe some of it we make up for by actual constituent outreach, like where you communicate in smaller forums like town hall meetings, face-to-face, in communities where you can still actually have a dialogue. But I'm not sure I've totally figured it out. I mean, my answer right this second is I just feel like we don't reward bad behavior, and we sit there and we still go back. We have all the information from our listening tours of what people told us they wanted us to work on. We actually have things we can do to move the ball forward on this, and at some point it feels like a leap of faith that if you keep working on what people want you working on, and you just work hard to get results that maybe people will notice. But I'm open to suggestions. I have not figured out how to bring out the best in everybody yet.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were talking about doing this, Susan Green asked me, she said, so why would anyone want to become president post-recall and pre-election? It seems like there could not be a more difficult time to be president of a one-seat majority Senate. So tell us why you wanted to do that, one, and two, let's give a little, what actually do you want to accomplish this session, and what do you think you can actually accomplish this session? But first, tell me why you took the job.
Where's Susan? That is a really good question. So, in a way, it really is true. It's the short straw. A lot of people think that, with the title is somehow something that's inherently better to do. But by taking this position, it's a fragile one vote. You become the piñata for the face of everything everyone is going to sort of kick and complain, both within your party for anything they don't like, and also for the other party who sees a mere one vote between you, for example, and Republican control in this case. But you take that job for the same reason you would run for office in the first place, which is there's an incredible opportunity. Anytime you run for office, you have a chance, even if it's uphill, you actually have a chance to affect public policy on every single issue you take up every day that affects 5 million people. That's amazing. I mean, and you lose some, and you get kicked down when you're doing some, but the advantage of coming in as president on this is that you get to help steer public policy on the front direction, or when you're figuring out what's the vision of where we're going and what can you try, and it affects the culture of, is it a feudalistic culture? Is it one of, well, don't really do anything because it's the only thing that's safe? Do you encourage people to think big and dream big and actually try and get things done? So I think it's kind of an enhanced opportunity for all the same things you care about that make you passionate to run for public office on the things you actually want to get done. It's a multiplier. And then after 9 years, and I can't believe I'm one of our most senior lawmakers at this point right now. But you learn some things about the process, so there's a chance to mentor other people through who really have the seeds of some good ideas, who are still coming from a very good place of who they're trying to help and how they're trying to help. And you get better at finding ways to sort of problem solve and help other people maneuver. So it's it would have been safer to stay majority leader, because there's plenty of things you can do as majority leaders. But you can do more to shape the agenda on the front end as Senate President, and so I guess that's the...
So what do you really want to get done?
What do you want to get done? So what I want to get done is in part shaped by the fact that we've got an 18-17 vote situation right now. You know, there are some things that I probably would want to do, actually, if we weren't that close. I wanted to make college affordability a leading issue for me. It's always been buried in a line item in the budget. It's not just a talking point that it helps with jobs, it's a fact. And we know that where most of the folks are going to be hiring on good paying jobs, it's just much, much less likely that you'll even be eligible for getting those jobs if you don't have it. I see it as part of this broader wealth inequality conversation we're having as well, where I actually think we're moving backwards. You know, with a 600% tuition increase here, I couldn't afford to go to college now where I went before, and even so, I'm still paying student loans. So I think if we step back and think about what kind of freedom people have to have the life they want, the job they want, to pursue anything else they want to do in their life, I think it begins there. And so you may have followed as the state has continued to cut higher ed. That cost shift has been moved to students, and it's flipped. So students are now paying the higher share instead of the state share. So I really want to do a variety of things to actually look at college affordability. Childcare is an interesting one that hasn't always hit the radar for what's top and center, and our Economic Poverty Reduction Task Force has really identified this as an issue. For those of you, and I don't have kids, but my brother has kids, and when he had 4 at one point in different stages of childcare, and it's now more expensive for 1 year of infant care and daycare than for a 4-year in-state tuition. So we're now asking families on stagnant wages after 30 years to somehow find a way to essentially pay the annual equivalent of in-state tuition per child just in daycare, and hope that at the tail end of that, they also still have money to send that same child to at least maybe an in-state option or trade school or something else like that. And so when you're looking at leveraging debt of the equivalent of a college education before they've even hit kindergarten, and then you're looking at that is that 600% inflation rate on college, and you're looking at stagnant wages, and you're talking about an increased share of healthcare expenditures, even for people who are insured out of pocket, even with the Affordable Care Act. To me, I feel like we've blocked opportunity for a generation. The $1 trillion that student loan debts are being carried by our young people, I think, amounts to indentured servitude. And it affects the careers they pursue and the dreams they have, where they start to make decisions based on how can I afford to pay back my student loans, as opposed to what do I really want to do with my life and my career. And so we do have to take care of floods and wildfires. The reason 2 more committees were requested is state roads got rebuilt, the county roads, many of them are still in terrible shape. For any of you who know folks that are still up north who are impacted by this. FEMA came through pretty well, but the process of repairing these communities is going to be an all session project. So maybe I'll leave it there, but one of the things I would say about child care too is when we've looked at the pay gap between men and women, this issue of child care, especially where you're talking single parents, is one of the factors that seems to weigh in behind the gap in wages for equal pay for equal work. And so those are priorities for us.
There's a lot of agreement, I think, particularly among people just general Coloradans about problems with higher ed. And and I think there's probably a lot of agreement on childcare expenses as well. And you're blocked by basically by the so-called, what we talked about a lot last year, called the Gordian knot, which goes back to Tabor, and a lot of these, there is enough money, but there's not enough money that the legislature can put its hands on in order to help resolve some of these problems. So we had something really strange happen, all kinds of things strange happen, right? We had the recalls, and then we had Amendment 66. And the interesting thing to me about Amendment 66 was 2 years ago, your majority leader, probably he did what was criticized as a too much off the wall, not organized enough, way to raise money for education, and it got clobbered 2-1. And then this year they raised the most money that's ever been raised for a Colorado initiative, right? I guess $10 million, something like that, and it got clobbered 2-1. So that would suggest that the problem isn't with how to run a campaign, but there's something, people aren't going to vote to raise taxes on themselves. We haven't seen that they ever will. They haven't yet. So if you have this basic problem, how do you address these issues that require somehow that problem to be resolved? It's an easy question.
Yes or no?
I guess you need to put marijuana in the title.
Go Broncos.
Peyton Manning, Bronco, marijuana
Bill. Education bill.
education.
Oh, yeah. I think there's some issues beyond how the campaign runs. So a couple observations. I think odd years, there's a political difference about who turns out to vote. And so that we saw not just in Amendment 66, but we saw in the Jefferson school board races. So odd year election turnout is something that we just have not figured out at all. When we were doing our listening tour in red, blue, purple parts of the state, and invariably it came up, someone in the crowd would bring up about the failure of Amendment 66. And I think we also had a little bit of coalition fall apart because it was criticized from the left for funding sort of air quote reforms and some of those things that were maybe policy abhorrent to some. It was criticized from the right just because it was $1 billion tax increase. But locally, there's still this sense of it'll all go to Denver. Like even if you break down the charts and show every single school district would have been a net beneficiary increase over where they were right now. And even superintendents and school board members who are very well informed and very educated just didn't believe it. They just thought basically that they would be paying and it would be for some other kid's school. So there's a parochialism. Now if you asked if there was a measure to raise taxes on yourself to pay for your school district, they were like, oh yeah, I would have supported that.
It went through in Jefferson County.
Yeah, I would have supported that, and that was true even amongst most of the conservatives that were out there as well. They thought if it was their school district, that they would have been well, and we're starting to see that with transportation, which also has no real prayer of finding a new funding source on a statewide level either. I think there's been some recent polling like in the 40% mark or something, which is really not anything that's so, obviously that did even worse. So one potential solution, and it's bizarre from a state perspective, but if we believe in getting services delivered to each of these places, we may have to try a regional approach. Long-term, the Tabor Gallagher 23 still remains there, and I remember my first year I came in on the House, it was like, Tabor's important, You know, it's gonna turn us into a third world state, and, you know, we're never gonna actually be able to evolve and progress. You know, for those of us who all grew up in Colorado, it's very heartbreaking to watch these things happen. So let's just repeal it. And I was doing some research with our legislative staff on repealing Tabor, and the first thing they say is, oh, well, a repeal of Tabor violates single subject. So what I learned in the process is 1992 Tabor, 1994 we passed the single subject, which is a great idea, but nobody put in a grandfather clause. So everything was multi-subject before 1994. So how do you repeal, amend, or change all of the multi-subject stuff that was shoved in our Constitution prior to 1994? You can't, because now it's a multi-subject. So you would have to balkanize them in a bunch of little itty-bitty wonky pieces. There is no such thing as a repeal of Tabor that is possible anymore. So from a policy perspective, you could go add a grandfather clause to single subject, and you could say anything that came in as one blob before a single subject can go out and be amended as sort of one blob without violating single subject. Trying to compel voters to see why that would be wise is an uphill. I mean, it's really wonky. So we've been fee funding. Colorado remains one of the most privatized states, where when you are, when you're sort of desperate for money, we have weird financing. You'll see more special districts in this state because of Tabor, sort of weird and less transparent workarounds to how you, so I would just call creative financing these boutique financing mechanisms to take care of things that used to be done sort of through the state or through a normal taxing structure. Most of the locals have debruced, so really you're going to see more of the share shifted back onto the locals, and creating things like arts districts. And all of these, we have over 3,000 special district governments in the state of Colorado and growing. And those are taxes too, but now developers are creating taxing entities. So we've got privately created taxing governments where nobody knows what they're doing or what they're up to, but they can tax, and actually often at higher rates. We had an audit that came through not that long ago on this use of special and metro districts. They had over $16 billion of funds collectively across these 3,000 governments that could not be accounted for, and that is basically the size of our entire state general fund. So, these things come at a very serious price, and they start wiggling through backdoor channels that I think are less transparent and less accountable, and long-term, it's going to need a constitutional fix, and if the voters don't have the appetite to vote for 66, I'm not sure the voters are ready to, even if we could repeal Tabor in one case, I'm not sure the voters are there. Marijuana.
Got it.
Single subject.
Right? Kind of.
It's either paper or marijuana.
Can't be borrowed. No, really, and we invite you to be partners on this, because really the future of our state, we really are doing a huge disservice. I mean, it is why we're 50th in mental health funding, and we're all paying a terrible price for that. And we could do things like get mental health counselors in every school, or at least middle school and high school. We could do things like expand clinic access, or bring tuition back down to the point where it was, or at least keeping pace with inflation. And none of those things are really going to be an option for us. We will continue to be sort of substandard in how we're serving people as long as we're dealing with the situation. So if you have solutions, let me know.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? Because Tabor didn't just come out of thin air in 1992 and land in Colorado and say all of a sudden it's there. It took a long time for that camp to get that amendment into our Constitution. And it seems that the people that hold this political philosophy are absolutely relentless in their positions, where we lose one election and say, well, that's all we can do, and let's walk away. It almost feels like, to me, it's almost like a surrender to the defeat of the electorate, where the opposition, the people that hold another point of view, would never think that way, and they would just keep going until they got what they wanted. And I kind of sense that we're not quite as animated or, together with that. Do you have any perspective on that?
Well, so I think it's a fair point. So a lot of what we've seen that has been an attack on a lot of our institutions has been cooked up, it's organized, it's been orchestrated, it's been a multi-year effort, and I think in some ways the guard was initially down. Like, that's so crazy that'll never pass. And in actually some very red states, I've looked at Colorado and gone, no, we're not doing that. So other people have learned from our mistake, but there's still to this day, if you ask people what they think Tabor is, the gap between what the law that Tabor does and what people think it is still really wildly different, because most people, their first reaction will still be like, oh, it's a right to vote on tax increases. And actually, if you break down all the different pieces of what Tabor are to this day, I think very few people actually realize what's in there. They have national organizational efforts, whether it's this or other bad ideas that we see.
Alec, that's a military subject.
This and others, there are others, this is not the only bad idea. But the genius, in a way, the evil genius of what I have to say, by putting it in our Constitution, really hamstrung us. I mean, this could have been fixed if it was in the state legislature. They were savvy because there's a populist appeal to the notion of a right to vote on taxes that seems to eclipse all the math that got put in the Constitution. And it's true to say that I think if you could probably find a very significant plurality of people who are pretty motivated to deal with the problem of Tabor. And then when you sit down in a room and talk about, well, should we try and deal with education's the most sympathetic face on this, so let's at least try and pull education out of the Tabor mess and hold them harmless, and that'll help with other areas of the budget. And then that goes down twice. And that's sort of poll tested, like that's the issue that would have been most sympathetic for people out there. And then you realize it's multi-subject. What I would do from a policy perspective, from a practical perspective, what would do the most good, the Tabor formula adjusts for caseload, or for inflation and population. It doesn't adjust for caseload. So the part of the Tabor formula that in mathematical reality is the most damaging is when your corrections caseload goes up or when your Medicaid caseload goes up, it's an inherent structural cut. So it not only doesn't go up, but it forces a cut really effectively by the amount of the Medicaid caseload or the corrections. So if you could add the words, if you could get the voters to add the words caseload, population, inflation, and caseload, to sort of pre-Tabor standards, the practical reality of handling our budget would nearly work. The other thing that would nearly work as a fix is if we could actually go back from 4.63%, which is where we are now, and basically take it back to the 5% we were at before. And many people don't know that, so Tabor also put in a flat tax. So a progressive taxing structure is not possible with Tabor on that as well. So if we still had to just make an adjustment on the rate, almost all the purely horrific cuts we've done and all the things that have aggressively moved us backwards, we would basically be in a very solid footing, frugal, but totally manageable if we could basically take that to 5%. But I guess to your other point, all of us that have thoughts about, even who agree about how problematic this is, there just isn't the same consensus about which is the best solution and what do we actually, there's almost no fix that doesn't involve the voters. And right now I think we're still on the weaker side of trying to understand how voters think and what they might actually support as a solution.
Yeah, and of course another problem is that it's so damn complicated that it's almost impossible
You
to
can't
make a
talk
reasoned
about it.
argument. I know in the Amendment 66 campaign, they try, I mean, you know, one of the things that's going to happen is that cities are going to soon move out of the ability to tax themselves by mill levies. I mean, because they're going to run into a wall, right? In places like Boulder, and you can't make that argument because it's not understandable. Every time the Amendment 66 people tried to make an argument other than look at the poor kids that can't get art class, every other argument failed. Every time they made any other argument, their numbers went down. The only argument that worked was, look at the poor kid, he can't take gym class. So, you know, gym class and art class are important, but are they worth $1 billion a year? And there has to be more of an argument, obviously, than that. And they couldn't figure out how to make one.
Let me take the second question so I can stand up.
Yeah.
Somebody else.
Oh, we have a question? Yeah.
But I actually heard the clarification. I'm Jackie Shenway. I ran for school board twice in Denver Public Schools on art, music, and physical fitness.
Hi, Jackie.
And I found that they used that in the mill levy to sell it when there were words in it that actually said that they could use it for that or extracurricular activities. What I think happened with 66 is it was not that people were behind it. It was the very thing they advertised. I read about 43,355 words. Art, music, and physical fitness were not even mentioned. So what happened was they thought they could sell it on that, and even in the stuff that was said there, it said, oh, and by the way, lawmakers can change this. People didn't vote for this, not because they didn't believe in education, or not because they didn't want to get around paper. They voted because if you can't be transparent and upfront on your advertising for 66, what makes you think those lawmakers are going to do a good job when they get the money? We're asking for $1 billion. I think and actually, you know what, Morgan? Do go after changing the case load thing. That's what you do. I'm a mathematician. Talk about it, okay? Do it. Go back to the people and be upfront. And I think what you'll find is people will go, wow, that's cool. Show them the math. Show them how it works. Show them how it really comes down to it. Show them examples, and I think they'll go for it. I went to all the presentations. I could not believe the number of senators and representatives who signed onto that bill who had not read it. And it specified all kinds of things about charters and paying for capital costs on charters and other things. And then everything, bottom line is when you read the whole thing, it said, oh, and by the way, lawmakers can change their minds anyway.
And I would agree with that.
Okay,
I've heard a lot of
I'm gonna say that.
people that said it was a blank check kind of
No.
thing, that you could, the funds become
That was the issue.
fungible, and so they didn't really necessarily get earmarked for education, and I heard a lot
But
of
the
that.
worst part was I went and read this crazy 4,300. I actually had other people reading it saying, am I missing this? Okay, and it was not spelled out because I'm both a finance person and I went for school board and I said the education side. I wasn't overwhelmed by reading it, even though it was a lot of words. My eyes were bloody by the time I finished. But it was long. But the sad part was is nowhere, not one single thing was mentioned about art, music, or physical fitness, or special needs. The Autism Society came out and said we're neutral. When they're starting to say they're neutral because there was nothing about special needs, that was the issue. Is it was specific on certain things, and then, but even at that, even though it said charter schools, we believe it or not, lawmakers can change it. I mean, talk to people about what really happened. I came out con on it, and it was hard for me because I'm a total education person who believes in, I want those rural schools to have their stuff. I was devastated that this was so misleading, and this bill was not what actually many of the lawmakers who signed on to it, it was not what they thought were told it was. Okay.
So one of the things that we also heard when we were around is just the complexity of the bill, and in order for it to get through the legislative process, there's weird relics of negotiations that you can see throughout the bill, that if you were starting with just, there was negotiations like within each of the school districts who, at the end of the day, you were trying to deal with some of the inequities in the schools, the current school finance formula where we're doing some of our greatest backfilling to some of our wealthiest districts and some of the least backfilling to some of our poorer districts. But what happened was sort of an amalgamation of different things and different ideas from different groups that was, something that Senator Johnston had needed to sort of form a coalition to get it through the building. And those very same things also meant that there was something for everyone to dislike in the bill. So it didn't matter where you were on the political spectrum, there's probably something in there that anybody could have liked and something in there that anybody could have disliked no matter where they were. And instead of the coalition saying, well, there's enough of some things to make it worth doing, we've really heard different no vote or different rationale for no. But that very process that helped get it through the legislature probably actually hurt it and made it complicated and included core pieces where even within our own caucus when we were voting on this, there were pieces of the bill, people were pointing to different parts of it, where if it were this piece by itself, they would have opposed. So I take your input and I also add to it that I think it also made it very complicated. And so when in doubt, I've often told people, especially at any point if you're messing with our Constitution, but when in doubt, vote no. And I think if you're asking for a tax increase, the local control aspect too, of being able to tell people exactly what it was gonna go for. On one hand, from the voter's perspective, you could have the state doing a measure like this that could have said it's all going, say, to something like classrooms, which I think would be very popular. And then the politics of education stuff in the building means that if you're doing anything to weaken local control, you're gonna run into a different problem there. And so in a way, the perfect storm of what happens is no one could really say 100% with factual accuracy exactly how it was going to be spent in every district because there was still enough local control retained that the final answer about where a lot of that money would go in each particular district couldn't be known until like the school district would do it. So anyway, I would add that to what you've said that I think
And Morgan, I totally appreciate that. And the only thing I would say is, Senator Carroll, I'm sorry, President Senator Carroll, is that, sorry, oops. But you know what I was going to say is the bigger issue is people were excited. They thought, oh my goodness, Jackie, because especially I really worked on making sure that people really got those issues out there, instead of, even though my degrees are math and science. And my point is that I really think those are important for us in well-rounded education. They literally came to me excited. They were voting for it. Said, Jackie, how much of the billion's going to go? So I start reading it. That's what I'm trying to, and there's nowhere in it. Not anything about physical education, not anything about art, and not anything about music being used over and over as though that's what it was about. That's what's disturbing. Do you see what I'm saying? The campaign made a huge mistake.
My name is Bob Wilson. I ran for our TD board in Urbana-Golden and lost in 2010. But my question is, first of all, thank you for the big scale picture of the microscopic issues. I'd like to go down the tracks and think about workforce and affordable housing. I've heard, I mean, it's a good thing to do to have affordable housing, perhaps near transit, near an RTD in the Roaring Fork Valley, near Aspen, or Glenwood Springs, or up in the Mason Street corridor in Fort Collins. But I've heard from the developers that they will not build any townhouses or anything because of something called latent or something defects that's 7 years. They don't want to build apartments. They don't want to build affordable housing near transit and other places. What's going on there? Is this a ruse? What's the big picture? Last Senate Bill 28, the next I think let's get more electric vehicles out there.
Very good. So one of the things I find interesting is people can find other people to be spokespeople for them. And the developers have realized that they aren't necessarily the most sympathetic face and voice for what they're trying to do. So we go as far as we actually all agree that there should be transit-oriented development. I think it's all kinds of reasons why it's the way to go. The communities to have environmentally health education. But the construction defects laws, so what they're really arguing is that they want to weaken consumer protections for defective construction. And they're offering a premise that in order to build affordable housing, you basically need to be able to sort of be given a little bit of a wink and a nod and an okay on your defective construction. And in other states, in order to get these projects going, you don't have to a consumer is at a disadvantage with a developer in the case where they really do build a defective product anyway. If you take like Bovalon or any of these other things where people have sunk a ton of money into complete lemon, for average people, it's a huge David and Goliath. It's absolutely asymmetric. But in the case of affordable housing, what I find so cynical about this is there's a desperate need for affordable housing, and we really do need transit-oriented development. So they therefore say, well, if you just sort of change all the rights to try and get rid of their rights and do this other stuff, so they can really afford it, we're going to have affordable housing and we're going to have transit-oriented development. And what it is every idea that this particular group has come up with has been about weakening consumer rights, making it harder for them to enforce their rights, and all of that is under the premise of construction defects. So a defect isn't an imperfection, it's negligent construction. It is absolutely possible to build affordable housing without doing it defectively. It is absolutely possible to build townhomes without weakening consumers' rights at all. So what we've been dealing with is, and this is a good case study and other issues we get, because it is the right problem that's been identified, and how much do you take at someone's first blush? What is your evidence of this? So let's say we removed all consumer protections for defective construction. You can do defective construction to promote new housing by these developers. Are they actually going to build the projects? When you dig into the issue, what it really is an insurance issue, where the insurance on the project is expensive. We don't collect the data, apparently, on claims with this, and we do no rate review on property and casualty insurance. So some of you may have been around for the original fight, and it was a fight, to get rate review on health insurance, which is basically a process that says the insurance commissioner can look and make sure that their rates are actuarially justified and reject unjustified rate hikes. We don't have that for property and casualty. So if the construction industry is facing an off-the-charts insurance product, and that is needed to build a project, then the issue we should be looking at is basically insurance rates, affordability, why are there other lines being offered in other states, but because of the politics of going after the insurance industry, the developers don't want to go after the insurance industry, they want to go after the poorest of the homeowners, which is the affordable housing people, and so that's kind of their take. So
What if you went from 7 to 3 years to figure, would that help any, or is it reasonable, or just more of the same?
it's not going to make a new project happen. So, I mean, if you look around what each of the states have as far as like what the tail of rights are, the problem is with each of those that are coming forward, you can do all of those things, but we're already among the weakest of the states as far as consumer protections versus home builders. It would be moving us the other direction. And even if you did it, you aren't going to see new projects being built. The new projects are a financial issue. So we could look at things like publicly bonding. We have enterprise zones. We have every which way of incentive you can possibly imagine we do right now in urban renewal authorities and all this tipping, and we can't seem to get the developers enough incentives as we go through. So, is there some kind of structure that makes the price point make more sense that doesn't compromise consumers' rights? And that is the question, and I think we're trying to pivot the solution into something that will actually get these projects built and isn't just sort of a backdoor attack on the civil justice system.
Thank you.
Sure.
To all the people who are really frustrated about the really long list of things you're not talking about this session, what do you say about what might happen next session?
Well, I'd actually say there's a lot we are doing this session that hasn't hit the list. So, the 2014 election is going to decide what is even possible in 2015. But we're doing, we're looking at air quality rules. There's uranium mining issues. So there's advances that are happening, for example, on the environmental front. Today, the big fight was over fixing tax equity issues on civil unions until we can get to marriage equality, which, but for that piece that's in our state Constitution right now, legislatively, our legislators would be willing to pass marriage equality today. As far as women's issues, there's choice issues that are coming up, both sort of offense and defense, that's happening on women's right to choose on these issues. This session, there's a Patient's Bill of Rights that is being worked on to proactively affirm sort of healthcare freedoms on choosing. There's obviously a lot of defense work we're doing there. So I guess in many of the areas that there are going to be some measures that are dealing with sort of consumer rights and protections. We're still going to see some criminal justice reform stuff happen. We're still going to see environmental stuff happen. We're still looking at issues of equality all the way
Workers'
through.
rights.
Probably not going to see the death penalty repealed this year.
Of course.
And in my perfect world, just for me personally, in 2015, if we have a majority and a governor that would sign it, I would really like to see that happen. That's an example of something that probably isn't going to happen this year. And part of that's just, we had our best shot actually last year, and votes were changed for cold feet, and we'll have to see if that's possible again in 15, but it would have a worse reception this year.
Do you have any more perfect world things that you could add, share with us?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So, under Colorado's Consumer Protection Act, all the things that are deceptive trade practices are essentially unenforceable right now. So we're in the top 10 as far as bad as far as frauds perpetrated against individual consumers. And this was something that was tried a couple years ago, and when the chambers were split, got it through the Senate, died in a Republican-controlled House. So this is all of the financial consumer protections about not lying to people and swindling and taking their money, or telling them you're selling them a new transmission and really selling them a used one, or the Nigerian sweepstakes and so on and so forth.
Wait, that's not real?
I won that. I won the Nigerian sweepstakes.
Yeah.
No.
And so I think that, I would be doing, if it were up to me, I would want to see an actual real meaningful Colorado Consumer Protection Act. We're among the 5th worst of the states that's there. I would do more with credit scoring. We did it as an employment barrier. I think we need to look at it as far as a reason to ding people up on their insurance. I've also seen scams on the rental housing market where they're now charging an application fee and doing a credit check, and they're taking applications and application fees from people they know they don't have vacancies, or they're not even going to accept. And so for some apartment folks, they're actually making more money on application fees than they are on renting. So those are things. As far as workers go, I think we're hoping for some pretty reasonable changes in workers' compensation. And if you've known anybody who's ever been hurt on the job, that's a really asymmetric system. It's very controlled by insurance interests there. We're hoping that we can actually do something for workers there. State contracting changes. So I guess I have a long wish list. If I had 20 senators still and a governor that would sign everything that I like, it'd be
Or
like,
anything.
everything I like. Maybe that's some sense of.
Yeah.
More from Mike. We love you more.
We need to start wrapping up here, so do you two want to say anything before I do? You guys are fun.
I could be wrong on this, but it seems to me that in the old days, like when we came to the House 9 years ago, that the Kill Committee was like an inside story that we didn't talk about. Employers did, but legislators didn't talk about the Kill Committee. We're sending something to the Death Penalty Committee. Is that right? Isn't that new? Did we always say we're sending 50 bills to the Kill Committee?
So,
What is the Kill Committee? Explain that to people who might not know.
the Kill Committee is any committee where your bill goes where it dies. I've had my bills killed in every committee before, so, but basically, this, for as long as I've been around and before, and this was initially a Republican concept for what went there. The difference being that the affiliation of the person was basically the deciding point. Hushed, not really talked about it. They saw an idea they liked there, they resuscitate it, and then they go make it a Republican bill. So our committee that Mike is talking about that was sort of harsh before, many times the House and the Senate will use state veterans and military affairs for multiple purposes. It has bills that deal with state affairs and veterans and military affairs. Elections, they have oversight over Scott Gessler. And Secretary of State's office.
That would be a full-time.
But whatever committee you do it in, when you're assigning a bill, if there's something you think is really an appalling, obnoxious, terrible idea that you think when you're time managing on the way out, and so you see a bill introducing the criminalization of doctors for abortion, yeah, that's gonna go to state affairs. And people, they have the same ability to testify and so forth, but part of what that is done for is a time management issue, because like our health committee or our judiciary committee are going to be putting more time on actually looking at bills that may need amendments or may be fixable if you negotiate. Some of these concepts come out of the gate, there's just, so we've got one, I think maybe tomorrow, that really is privatizing all of K-12 education. There is no amendment that's going to fix that, that is going to make it anything other than crazy. So if you introduce a crazy bill.
Is that like Johnston's, or?
And also, I mean, to us, a lot of the bills that are doing like mandatory arming of teachers, in the classroom, there's a unique kind of bill that finds its place there. And no, it hasn't always been talked about, but we internally have always known. I mean, you have total discretion about where you assign, but it's the math. Bills come out of state affairs, bills die in state affairs, bills die in other committees as well.
You put hoods on the head.
We don't put cards on. But yeah, so I'm for all of you who've been watching the process, you no doubt have seen that. I mean, it's obviously bills will either pass or fail in either committee, but really extreme bills generally tend to find their first home in state affairs.
Mike, you said something about donation for the luncheons.
In 2011, though, in 2011, we had Speaker of the House Frank McNulty seemed to have trouble counting, vote counting, and he had a one vote majority, and that's where you're at now. Do you have extra counters that are helping you out? How does that happen? Or how does that
She's
not
smarter.
happen? How does that not happen?
It's really a lot less fun. I gotta say, it's a lot less fun to only have one vote to work with, because of course Democrats have differences of opinion. So we do have to be extra careful and extra good vote counting, extra good negotiating and amending as we go through. We're going through this session very precarious, because all it takes is one Democrat to flip or defect or be surprised all the way through. So communications, basically, the short answer is we have to compensate with better communications than we've ever had. Also, even though we were going through unprecedented recalls, my instruction to my senators was to research the heck out of their bills and do their work prior to introduction and count their votes, if possible, prior to introduction. Because you can go a different direction, you can write a slightly different bill. If there's going to be a problem in the 18 of our caucus, and that doesn't mean you stop there and you don't count Republicans, but if you're going to see a fault line of division, figure out what you can do to get that addressed prior to introduction if possible, because we know the press is also going to be looking for stories of infighting. And it won't be hard because, you know, the 18 Democrats have 18 different views on everything. And it is procedurally very possible, you know, one person defecting can effectively flip the majority, not just on a bill, but who's really running the floor.
I think that we're done.
I think we're done.
You've done it.